Parag Khanna, founder and CEO of AlphaGeo, best-selling author, globetrotter. Great to see you here in Munich.
Not as much as you.
Yeah, well, I don't know. We both have a lot of miles. Is the way to put it, I guess. So, okay, the theme here, under destruction, which of course refers to the current state of the global world order. And I've heard now for the first time since 2002, under George W. Bush in the lead up to the Iraq War, the phrase coalition of the willing. What does that mean in this context?
It is a blast from the past, right? Can we also just challenge the premise, under destruction? I appreciate that the Munich Security Conference has made this the title of their report, but if we look at history, and they're also mindful of history, so it's not that painful a corrective for them to understand that there's always institutional competition in diplomacy, right? It's not that one order dominates for some, eternal period or some very long period, and then suddenly there's a collective decision to change. There's perpetual competition going on. So let's not call it under destruction. Let's say we're in a moment of, call it interregnum, but certainly there's many modes of diplomacy. And that brings us to the coalitions of the willing. And that is 20 years old. And it is the American way, let's say. Yes, America did build a multilateral architecture together with its allies and partners in the post-war system 80 years ago. But at the same time, America has been practicing a la carte multilateralism, which is another way of saying identifying tactical coalitions that suit certain purposes for at least a few decades. And so now that is just simply out in the open again, and it's going to remain that way because what it's coupled with is the US also pulling out of certain multilateral organizations, actually dozens of them. And that coalition style we can contrast with the European approach, which we think of as being very consensus-oriented, and the Asian approach, which is very consultative. But even the Europeans, which, as you're observing here, are saying that, well, the consensus approach that Europe takes to making all decisions, that's not going to fly either. They need to have a multi-speed, multi-tier Europe, where they're also going to have internal coalitions, right, in their decision-making. So maybe the whole world is moving towards the coalition style.
And who does that benefit? Governments, private sector?
Well, the participants, I would say. You'd rather be in the tent, in the in-group, in any given coalition, if it suits your interest, than not in it, right? And the same is true, or was true, of multilateralism. So these coalitions are being built on the fly, issue-specific. They're expanding and contracting as countries join or not. And there are even tiers within those coalitions. So you can see, on the one hand, it almost resembles tariff policy. It's incredibly haphazard and shooting from the hip. But view it again in that broader construct of this perpetual competition among what is the ideal type or the most useful, functional, institutional form to pursue at any given time. And when it comes to the issue by issue, situations that we're dealing with right now, I'm actually okay with it.
So it's interesting, you talk about tariffs. When we think about trade, you've made an interesting point about maritime policy and Indo-Pacific being a major trade route. That's, for all the talk of technology, shipping is still the biggest way to move things around the world. So how does this kind of coalition of the willing concept impact that?
So the shifts in, like, say, maritime security, right, and maritime order to protect sea lines of communication, transportation corridors for critical goods, whether it's commodities or semiconductors, whatever the case may be, that has also been in evolution for a few decades. As China has become more powerful, it's built out its navy beyond its first island chain, its merchant marine, and its coast guard fleets, and its almost a sort of civilian and commercial maritime presence is enormous all over the world. You would expect them to want to protect their own supply chains. The Indian Navy wants to bestride the Indian Ocean. It doesn't feel that it needs to be second fiddle there as well. So you've had a multipolarity in the maritime domain emerging for some time, and then look at specific instances, like whether it's the Houthi rebels, in the Red Sea, or of course in the South China Sea. You have Europeans playing more of a naval presence in the South China Sea, even coming closer to Taiwan, for example. And with the Houthis, it's been these coalitions. It's coalitions, and coalitions for each of these areas. And again, that is the way it actually has been working, even when we think that there has been one neat, structured, hierarchical system.
When we hear these messages from, for example, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, others within the so-called middle powers, that we have choices. Yeah. What does that imply? Does that imply we can choose China? And are they really going to do that?
Well, everyone is practicing what I call multi-alignment, right? They're saying even if you have a very fixed, firm, legacy, historical partnerships, relationships like the US and Canada, which is obviously still 80+% of their trade, in case anyone needs to be reminded, if not more. That doesn't mean that they're not going to branch out and look in all directions and diversify. And what is new in this multi-alignment picture is that even America's allies are doing it. It's a term that we traditionally ascribe to the middle powers. Saudi Arabia will multi-align, Kazakhstan will multi-align, Brazil will try its hand at multi-alignment, India will. But now America's own allies. So what you can see with Canada is the visit to China and trying to seek greater market access there, which Europeans are also doing. The Europeans saying, if we can offset, or if we trade more, export more to India, to Southeast Asia, to Japan, and to Mercosur, we will offset 90% of what our export losses to the US are going to be. That's the kind of calculation that every country is making. And again, it's perfectly rational. It's a bottom-up kind of reconstruction and diversification. Everyone is hedging, everyone is diversifying. And I want to make an important point because I'm a nothing if not a globalization advocate. All of this does not mean globalization is dead. It's quite the opposite, right? As you can see, everyone building more networks with everyone else does not sound like deglobalization to me.
No, I was going to say, I specifically was going to ask you, is this the end of globalization, or is it just globalization finding new friends?
Absolutely. And again, the more friends you find, the more resilient globalization becomes because you're fundamentally diversifying, right? You're building more networks and you're building more optionality into the system. Globalization is not supposed to be a hierarchical, unilateral imposition, right? It's supposed to be these networks. And a world of more broader distributed networks is actually going to be a more stable world in my view.
So let's flip this notion of under destruction on its head for a second. Is there a world where this is actually a stabilizing function?
Coalitionism can lead to instability, right? Because again, of course, a lot of people will gravitate straight to a World War I analogy and say you have these, automatic alliance patterns, but that's exactly not what it is, right? Every country is calibrating to what extent they want to be all in with a certain approach versus when it may cost them too much. So, for example, primary and secondary sanctions, right, in trade relationships or with commodities and sanctions on Russia, very appropriate topic for right now. You've seen countries like India say, look, we're only going to cooperate or participate. Even Japan, which is obviously a robust, liberal, Western ally, even they have sought to, limit the extent to which the price caps and export controls and limitations on purchasing Russian commodities would affect their economy. In general, any country that's commodities import dependent, right, such as most Asian economies, and India in particular are not really going to let some notion of values or alignment or desired alignment with the West ultimately dictate their foreign policy. They're going to vote with their wallet, in other words, as India has clearly done. So every country is saying, well, sure, I'll happily be part of the critical minerals coalition, the mine to magnet or semiconductor coalition in whatever tier so that I can have access, so that I can be a production center, so that I can boost my exports, so that I can gain technology. But if the US then tries to impose blanket down the line that every member of this coalition has to no longer export XYZ, someone else, they may balk at that. And so we're going to find that there's going to be micro level, kind of tensions within these coalitions.
So it's sort of like cafeteria coalitionism. Like we used to say cafeteria Catholics back in the day. I went to Catholic school, so I can say that. But so when we look at that, I can pick and choose notion of coalitionism. The one thing that does sort of fall by the wayside are values. And so, when we start to talk about things like shared values around human rights, equality, does that fall by the wayside?
I think it depends on what the coalition is for, right? I mean, you can have coalitions simply around maintaining, liberalism in culture. This is actually something that the White House or the State Department is doing, right? They have launched a whole office for the promotion of Western values, by which they kind of mean more American values than universalistic-oriented Western values. And they're financing, political parties right here in Europe, among other places, to promote that. If you want to call that values, you can. If you mean universal values, well, there's been an erosion in consensus around what are universal values and what's the hierarchy or priority of universal values for quite some time, quite frankly, for decades. In America, it would be political sort of rights, whereas in Asia, it's going to be economic rights, for example, and things like this. So I think that I wouldn't blame any particular administration or any new approach to issue X for the erosion of some kind of global values consensus.
Parag Khanna here in Munich. Where are you off to next?
That's a great question. You tell me, I'll follow you.
I think I'm going to be in New York for hopefully a couple of weeks. just settle down after all this travel. But great to see you.
Yeah. Thank you.